El mañana en que Clyde Burns encontró a ese perro, pensó que había visto la peor crueldad que un hombre podía infligir en otra criatura vivienda. Estaba equivocado. Lo que estaba debajo de ese maldito saco de burlap testaría cada principio que había construido su vida solitaria y lo forzaría a elegir entre la seguridad del silencio y una lucha que podría destruir todo lo que había trabajado. Clyde había estado revisando su línea de puente cuando encontró algo que no pertenecía. Una forma oscura apuntaba cerca de su trozo de agua, sin movimiento, como la muerte en sí misma. Sus zapatillas de calor crujían a través del graso seco, mientras se aproximaba agitándose contra el sol medianoche. Cuanto más se aproximaba, más mal se sentía todo. Era un perro, pero no como cualquier perro debería ser. Un saco de burlap oscuro cubría completamente la cabeza del animal atascado y cerrado alrededor del cuello, con una cuerda roja que había vestido de patas rígidas en la espalda. La maestra estaba perfectamente still, tremulando un poco, como si hubiera aprendido que ese movimiento solo traía más dolor. Su cintura se mostró a través de una cinta que debería haber sido rosada, pero en lugar de eso, se sentaba dulce y matada con negligencia. Las manos de Clyde se movían mientras alcanzaba la cuerda. En 30 años de ranchamiento, había sufrido mucho tratamiento duro, pero esto era diferente. Esto era crueldad deliberada, metódica y paciente. Alguien había tomado tiempo para asegurar que este animal sufriera en la oscuridad y confusión. Los nudos eran tigres profesionales, atascados por manos que sabían exactamente qué estaban haciendo. Cuando el saco finalmente se liberó, lo que Clyde vio en los ojos de la maestra hizo que su estómago se volteara. No solo miedo. Había visto mucho de eso en animales espantosos. Esto era algo más profundo, más romántico. El tipo de aspecto que vino de tener la esperanza golpeada, de uno golpe a la vez. Su ojo izquierdo estaba abierto, casi cerrado, y los cortes frescos marcaron su musculatura, donde el saco se rompió contra la carne tendera. La maestra no apuntó la espalda cuando la cubierta salió. Solo estaba ahí brillando en la luz de repente, como si hubiera olvidado lo que el mundo parecía. Clyde nunca había sido mucho por lágrimas, pero algo caliente se hundió detrás de sus ojos cuando miró a esta criatura rompida que alguien había sacado de su tierra como trapo. Sabía de perros. Había estado con ellos toda su vida. Esta maestra era de calidad probablemente valiente, más que la mayoría de los hombres creados en un año. Alguien no había solo abandonado a ella, la habían torturado primero. La pregunta que se estaba quemando en la mente de Clyde no era quién haría tal cosa. En una ciudad como la suya, donde el dinero hablaba más fuerte que la conciencia, podía pensar en varios candidatos. La verdadera pregunta era qué planeaba hacer con respecto a eso. Porque mientras Clyde se dirigía con las manos lindas sobre las heridas de la maestra, revisando las heridas más profundas, notó algo que hizo que su sangre se hundiera con frío. Imágenes frescas en el humo alrededor de su trapo. Múltiples carros. Tracos recientes que sugerían que quien hubiera dejado esta criatura rompida aquí no había solo abandonado a ella y salido. Habían estado observando, esperando ver qué haría el abogado más notorioso de la ciudad cuando se enfrentara con la crueldad de alguien más. Y desde la rueda que observaba su propiedad, Clyde podía afirmar que vio el brillo de la luz de algo que se veía sospechosamente como un espagueti. No estaba solo mirando a un carro abandonado, estaba mirando a un test. Y quien hubiera instalado esta trampa estaba todavía ahí mediando su respuesta, esperando ver si Clyde Burns se acordaría de su propio negocio como siempre lo hacía, o si esta vez sería diferente. La maestra levantó su cabeza un poco, esos ojos dañados, reuniéndose con algo que podría haber sido el más fainte brillo de esperanza. Y en ese momento, Clyde se dio cuenta de que cualquier elección que hiciera a continuación iba a sonar muy lejos de su rincón silencioso, a lugares donde hombres poderosos hicieron decisiones sobre qué tipo de crueldad la comunidad toleraría. pero todavía no tenía ni idea de cuánto lejos algunas personas iban a guardar sus secretos. El primer instinto de Clyde fue llegar a la maestra dentro, lejos de los ojos dañados. Pero mientras sube lentamente hacia su jardín, cada paso revelaba nuevos horrores. Los cuernos de los animales habían sido negleccionados deliberadamente, crecidos tanto que se levantaban haciendo cada movimiento doloroso. Quienes hubieran hecho esto no solo le querían dañar, sino que querían asegurarse de que nunca volviera a correr. Dentro del jardín oscuro, las manos de Clyde trabajaban con cuidado, revisando las heridas mientras su mente corría. La marca de la maestra era parcialmente obscura por la humedad seca, y lo que parecía una herida deliberada, pero él podía hacer suficiente para reconocer el marco. Su sangre se acalentó cuando los pedazos se colocaron. Este era uno de los carros de Gideon Marsh, el hombre que sopló animales a la mitad del territorio y que tenía suficiente influencia para que los problemas desaparecieran. Pero Gideon no solo vendía carros. Todo el mundo sabía que él manejaba negocios de lado, que la gente decente no le preguntaba. Si este maestro le pertenecía y alguien lo dejó aquí en esta condición, significaría una de dos cosas. O Gideon estaba enviando un mensaje a Clyde, o alguien estaba tratando de enfocar al hombre más poderoso en 3 ciudades por la crueldad animal. Ninguna posibilidad votó bien por un simple agricultor que solo quería estar solo. Clyde agarró agua y lo pequeño que tenía mirando como el maestro se acercaba a la semilla con cuidado desesperado. Habría aprendido a no confiar en la amistad, probablemente porque había sido usado contra ella antes. Cada movimiento delicado que hizo la causó que la atrapara, esperando dolor en lugar de ayuda. Cuando limpió sus heridas con cuidadosas manos, Clyde se encontró hablando con ella en tonos bajos, no porque creyó que los animales entendían palabras, sino porque su propia angustia necesitaba ir a algún lugar antes de que lo consumiera completamente. Alguien había pasado semanas, tal vez meses, sistemáticamente rompiendo el espíritu de esta criatura. No era el trabajo de la crueldad de un momento. Fue paciencia, tortura metódica. El sonido de los golpes de ojos hizo que ambos Clyde y el maestro se desfriaran. A través de la puerta abierta del jardín, vio a 3 camioneros acercarse a su propiedad con la confianza casual de hombres que esperaban no resistir. Los reconoció de inmediato. Gideon Marsh se afiló a 2 de sus manos asesoradas, hombres cuyas reputaciones se construyeron para resolver problemas con la violencia cuando las palabras faltaban. Gideon se desmanteló con la lentitud teatral, sus zapatos caros golpeando el suelo con autoridad. Era un hombre que entendía el poder de la presentación, vestido en ropas que costaban más de lo que la mayoría de las familias vieron en un año. Pero sus ojos guardaban la oscuridad de alguien que había aprendido que el miedo era más útil que el respeto. Clyde Burns llamó Gideon su voz, cargando fácilmente a través del jardín. He oído que has encontrado algo que me pertenece. Pensé que iba a recoger lo que era mío antes de que se desarrollara ningún malentendido. Clyde salió del jardín posicionándose entre Gideon y el alcalde. En la oscuridad de la tarde, podía ver la calculación en la expresión del otro hombre, mejorando, pesando, decidiendo cuánta fuerza sería necesaria para resolver esta situación en silencio. No puedo decir que he encontrado algo que pareciera pertenecer a alguien, respondió Clyde. Su voz estaba firme, a pesar del golpe de su corazón. Solo un animal medio muerto que alguien rompió en mi tierra. El sonrisa de Gideon era fino como una espada. Ahora eso es interesante, porque tengo 3 testigos que vieron que tenías posesión de propiedad robada. Hace a un hombre preguntar qué más podría estar escondiéndose aquí en toda esta isolación. La amenaza fue sutil, pero inolvidable. En un territorio donde la ley más cercana era 2 días de viaje, hombres como Gideon Marsh eran ley para ellos mismos. Y Clyde había solo hecho un problema que necesitaba resolver. Pero mientras el joven mayor se movía del jardín detrás de él, Clyde se dio cuenta de que ya había hecho su elección. La única pregunta ahora era cuán alto el precio sería y si vivía lo suficientemente para pagarlo. El silencio se estrelló entre los hombres como una espada preparada para apretarse. Clyde podía sentir el peso de la decisión que se sentaba en sus espaldas, más pesada que cualquier pesadilla que tuviera en su vida solitaria. Detrás de él, el mayor se movía nerviosamente en el jardín, como si pudiera sentir la violencia en el aire, como el fuego antes de un fuego. Las manos de Gideon se movían con facilidad desplazando a Clyde en ambos lados. Estos no eran caballeros o trabajadores. Eran los tipos de hombres que se especializaban en hacer que los problemas desaparecieran permanentemente. El mayor, un maldito bruto llamado Pike, dejó su mano descansar casualmente en la gripa de su revólver. ¿Sabes, Clyde?, continuó Gideon su tono conversacional a pesar de la amenaza debajo. Siempre he respetado tu deseo por la privacidad. El hombre quiere mantenerse a sí mismo. Eso es su negocio. Pero cuando alguien empieza a interferir con mi propiedad, bueno, eso se convierte en el negocio de todos. Clyde se sintió su boca seca como piedra, pero su voz quedó firme. Lo gracioso de la propiedad es que siempre he pensado que un hombre es responsable de cuidar lo que le pertenece. Lo que encontré en mi jardín no parecía mucho como si hubiera sido cuidado. Las palabras caían en el aire como un desafío metido en la tierra. La cara de Gideon se oscureció y por un momento el mascoto civilizado salió suficiente para revelar el brutal pragmatista debajo. Este era un hombre que había construido su imperio con el entendimiento de que algunas personas eran disponibles a algunos animales aún más. Cuidado, Burns. Estás caminando hacia una colina que no puedes ver el fondo de. Pero antes de que Clyde pudiera responder, el sonido de otro perro, aproximándose, hizo que todos los 5 hombres se devolvieran. Un solo piloto estaba aproximándose a un ritmo firme, y Clyde sintió su corazón caer cuando reconoció al novio. Mercy Whitmore, el único veterinario del territorio, estaba llegando exactamente en el momento equivocado. Mercy era una mujer que había ganado respeto en la profesión de un hombre a través de competencia severa y refusión obstinada de ser intimidada. Había atrapado más animales y hombres que nadie más en 3 ciudades, pero su horario hoy podría ser fatal para todos ellos. Encargó su perro justo fuera del círculo de tensión, sus ojos experimentados rápidamente para asesorar la situación. Mercy había visto suficientes confrontaciones para reconocer cuándo la violencia estaba a punto de eruptar, pero nunca había sido una persona a la vuelta de lo que necesitaba hacer. «Hombres», dijo desmontando con eficacia brusca. «Me di cuenta de que había un animal herido que necesitaba atención. Pensé que era mejor que viera lo que podía ser hecho». Gideon's jaw tightened. La presencia de un testigo, especialmente uno con la reputación de Mercy por hablar su mente, complicó sus planes considerablemente. Pero a Pike, el armado asesinado, parecía menos preocupado con la subtilidad. «Puede que tengas la información equivocada, señora. No hay nada aquí que te preocupe». Mercy's eyes flashed with dangerous fire. She'd been threatened by better men than Pike and lived to tell about it. «I'll be the judge of what concerns me when it comes to injured animals. That's what I'm paid for». The mare chose that moment to whinny again from inside the barn, the sound carrying clear distress. Mercy's head turned toward the noise like a hound catching a scent, and Clyde saw the exact moment when her professional instincts overrode any sense of personal safety. «That animal's in pain», she said, moving toward the barn with determined strides. «I need to examine it». Pike stepped into her path, his hand now openly resting on his weapon. «I don't think so». The confrontation that had been building between Clyde and Gideon suddenly shifted, becoming something larger and more dangerous. Mercy was well known and respected throughout the territory. Her disappearance or injury would bring questions that even Gideon's influence might not be able to silence. But as Clyde watched the calculation in Gideon's eyes, he realized the man was weighing those consequences against the potential damage if Mercy examined the mare and started asking the wrong questions. The horse's condition would tell its own story to someone with veterinary training, a story that could unravel more than just Gideon's reputation. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and dried blood from the barn. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out the sound, sharp and wild in the tense air. And Clyde understood that the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of one tortured animal, but whether 3 people would leave his ranch alive. Because men like Gideon Marsh didn't get where they were by leaving witnesses to their mistakes. The standoff stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Mercy stood her ground, professional determination, overriding the danger radiating from Pike and his companion. But Clyde could see the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted between the armed men and the barn where the mare's suffering continued. Gideon made his decision with the cold calculation of a man who'd survived by knowing when to escalate and when to retreat. Pike, stand down. Let the lady look at the animal. The command surprised everyone, including Pike, whose scarred face twisted with confusion. But Gideon's reasoning became clear as he continued. Of course, I'll need to be present during any examination, being the rightful owner and all. Mercy's eyes narrowed. She dealt with enough corrupt officials and powerful men to recognize a trap being set. But her oath as a veterinarian left her no choice. An animal was suffering, and that trumped everything else. Fine, she said, moving toward the barn with purposeful strides. But I work alone with injured animals. They're skittish enough without a crowd watching. Clyde fell into step beside her, knowing this might be his last chance to warn her before they walked into whatever Gideon was planning. Mercy, he said quietly, maybe you should know what you're getting into here. But before he could explain, they were inside the barn, and Mercy's sharp intake of breath told him words were no longer necessary. Her trained eyes took in the mare's condition with professional thoroughness, cataloging each injury, each sign of deliberate abuse. The brand that Clyde had partially identified was now clearly visible, and Mercy's face went pale as she recognized it. Dear God, she whispered, running gentle hands over the mare's damaged hooves. This isn't neglect. Someone did this systematically. Over months, Gideon appeared in the barn doorway, backlit by harsh sunlight. Now that's a serious accusation, Miss Whitmore. Hope you've got proof to back up claims like that. Mercy straightened her fear, transforming into righteous anger. The proof is standing right here. These hooves were deliberately allowed to grow until walking became agony. These cuts around the eyes and muzzle, they're from something being tied too tight, left on too long, and this scarring over the brand. She stopped, her voice catching, as the full implications hit her. Someone had tried to alter the brand to hide the horse's true ownership, but the work had been crude, done with hot iron, while the animal was alive and conscious. The mare bore the marks of torture, designed not just to cause pain, but to erase her identity. You're saying someone stole my horse, tortured it, then dumped it here to frame me. Gideon's voice carried mock concern, but his eyes were calculating. That's quite a conspiracy theory. But Mercy wasn't backing down. I'm saying this animal has been systematically abused by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And since this is your brand, Mr. Marsh, I'd say you've got some explaining to do. The temperature in the barn seemed to drop 10 degrees. Pike and his companion moved closer, their intentions clear. Clyde realized that Mercy's professional integrity had just signed all their death warrants. She'd identified too much, connected too many dots. Gideon's mask of civility finally slipped completely. You know, Miss Whitmore, sometimes a person can be too smart for their own good. See too much, ask too many questions. Are you threatening me? I'm educating you about the realities of life out here. Some knowledge is dangerous. Some accusations can't be taken back once they're made. The mare whinnied softly, as if sensing the violence about to erupt around her. Clyde found himself calculating distances, to the door, to the pitchfork hanging on the wall, to any weapon that might even the odds against 3 armed men. But mercy surprised them all. Instead of backing down, she moved closer to the mare, placing herself between the animal and Gideon. Then, "I guess we have a problem. Because I took an oath to protect animals from cruelty, and I don't break my oaths." The silence that followed was broken only by the mare's labored breathing and the soft scratch of boots on hay-covered ground as Pike and his partner flanked the veterinarian. Gideon's hand moved to his gun, and Clyde understood that whatever happened next would be decided in seconds, not minutes. Because some lines once crossed led to places where the only choices left were between different kinds of death. The moment hung suspended like smoke in still air, everyone frozen in the deadly tableau. Then the mare made the decision for them all. She shifted weight to her damaged hooves and let out a sound no human present would ever forget. Not quite a scream, not quite a whinny, but something that spoke of suffering so profound it cut through every other consideration. Mercy's professional instincts overrode her survival instincts. She moved toward the animal hands, already reaching for her medical bag. "She's going into shock. I need to. You need to step away from that horse." Pike's voice was flat, final. His gun was half drawn, the threat unmistakable. But Clyde had reached his breaking point. 30 years of minding his own business, of letting other people's cruelty pass by without comment, crystallized into a single moment of absolute clarity. He grabbed the pitchfork from the wall in one smooth motion, the wooden handle solid and familiar in his calloused hands. Pike, his voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You pull that iron. I put this through your chest." The scarred gunman's eyes flicked to the pitchfork, calculating. Clyde might not be fast with a gun, but with a farm tool in his hands, he was deadly dangerous. The math of violence suddenly became more complicated. Gideon's face twisted with rage. His carefully laid plans were unraveling, and desperate men made desperate choices. Burns, you're making the biggest mistake of your life. You think that fork makes you dangerous? We'll burn this place down around your ears. Maybe. Clyde's grip tightened on the pitchfork, but you'll be dead before the first flame catches. Mercy used the distraction to move closer to the mare, her hands working quickly to assess the most critical injuries. What she found made her blood run cold. Fresh wounds beneath the dried blood, carefully hidden but unmistakable to trained eyes. Someone had been working on this animal recently, within the last day or two. "Gideon," she said, her voice carrying across the barn with surgical precision. "This horse was tortured yesterday, maybe even this morning, which means whoever did this is still active, still practicing their cruelty." The implication hit like a physical blow. If the abuse was recent, it meant the perpetrator was nearby, still engaged in systematic torture. And since the horse bore Gideon's brand, the finger of suspicion pointed directly at him and his operation. Pike's patience snapped. Enough talking. His gun cleared leather with practiced speed, swinging toward Clyde. But Clyde had been ready. The pitchfork flew through the air with deadly accuracy, catching Pike's center mass and driving him backward into the barn wall. The gunman's shot went wild, the bullet splintering wood somewhere above their heads. The second hired hand reached for his weapon, but Mercy proved she was more than just a veterinarian. The heavy metal case containing her surgical instruments caught him across the temple with a sickening crack, dropping him to his knees in the straw. Gideon found himself facing 2 angry people with nothing left to lose. His own gun was in his hand, but the mathematics of survival had shifted dramatically. 1 shot, 2 targets, and if he missed either one, he was a dead man. "This doesn't end here," he snarled, backing toward the barn door. "You think you've won something? You've just declared war on everyone who matters in this territory. There's nowhere you can run, no one who'll help you." Clyde pulled the pitchfork free from Pike's chest. The the man's breath coming in shallow gasps as he slumped against the wall. "Then I guess we'll have to make our stand right here." Gideon's retreat was strategic, not cowardly. He was a man who understood that battles were won by choosing the right ground, the right time. Today had been a setback, but the war was far from over. "Mercy," he called from the doorway. "You'd best remember what you've seen here today, and what happens to people who can't keep their professional observations to themselves." Then he was gone, riding hard toward town, with his remaining conscious gunmen slumped across his saddle. But his words hung in the barn like a curse, because everyone present understood their truth. They'd crossed a line today, and there would be consequences. Mercy knelt beside the mayor, her hands gentle despite the violence that had just erupted around them. "We need to get her proper care, but moving her might kill her." Clyde looked down at Pike, who was still breathing, but probably wouldn't be for long. "We've got bigger problems than one horse now. Gideon's going to come back with more men, and next time he won't try to be subtle about it." The mayor lifted her head, those damaged eyes meeting his with what might have been gratitude. And Clyde realized that in saving one broken animal, he'd probably doomed them all. But as he watched Mercy work with gentle competence to ease the horse's suffering, he couldn't bring himself to regret the choice. Some things were worth dying for. The question was whether they'd live long enough to see if their sacrifice meant anything. Pike died as the sun reached its peak, his last breath rattling through punctured lungs, while Mercy worked desperately to save the mayor. The violence that had erupted in Clyde's barn left them with a corpse and unconscious gunman, and the certainty that Gideon would return with enough firepower to level the entire ranch. "We can't stay here," Mercy said, her hands never stopping their work on the horse's wounds. "Gideon's got 20 men who'll ride out here the moment he reaches town. We'll be surrounded before sunset." Clyde dragged Pike's body outside his mind, calculating their limited options. Running wasn't possible. The mayor couldn't travel, and leaving her behind would make everything they'd sacrificed meaningless. Fighting was suicide against 20 armed men. But there was a third option, one that required more courage than violence. "What if we don't run?" he said, returning to the barn. "What if we make them come to us on our terms?" Mercy looked up from her work, understanding immediately what he meant. "You want to expose him publicly. Force him to act in the open where people can see. Gideon's power comes from operating in shadows, making problems disappear quietly. But if the whole territory sees what he's done to this horse, sees him trying to kill witnesses to cover it up," the unconscious gunman stirred, groaning as consciousness returned. Clyde bound his hands with rope, then hauled him upright against the barn wall. The man's eyes focused slowly, taking in the scene around him with growing fear. "Your boss left you behind," Clyde said conversationally. "Pike's dead, and you're next if Gideon decides you know too much. Might want to consider where your loyalties really lie." The gunman spat blood but remained silent. These were men trained in violence, not necessarily in loyalty. Clyde could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing the certainty of Gideon's revenge against the possibility of survival if he cooperated. Mercy stood wiping her bloodied hands on a cloth. "She'll live if we can keep her stable. But Clyde, what you're suggesting, taking on Gideon publicly, means taking on everyone who profits from his operations. Half the businesses in town pay him protection money. Then maybe it's time this territory learned what they've been protecting." The sound of approaching riders cut their conversation short. But instead of the thunder of 20 horses, Clyde had expected only 3 animals approached at a steady walk. Through the barn door, he watched an unexpected sight. The territorial judge, flanked by 2 federal marshals, riding toward his ranch with official purpose. Judge Morrison was a man whose reputation for fairness had survived 20 years on the frontier bench. His presence here now suggested that word of the confrontation had already reached official ears. But whether that was good news or catastrophic depended entirely on which version of events had been told first. The judge dismounted with the careful movements of an older man who'd spent too many years in the saddle. His weathered face revealed nothing as he took in the scene. The blood in the dirt, the bound prisoner, the defensive postures of Clyde and Mercy. "Mr. Burns," he said formally, "I've received reports of violence on your property. Federal law requires me to investigate when territorial citizens are killed or threatened." One of the marshals, a lean man with watchful eyes, stepped forward. "We also received word that stolen federal livestock might be involved. That makes this a federal matter." Clyde felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. Federal involvement meant Gideon's local influence carried less weight. But it also meant the stakes had just escalated beyond a simple territorial dispute. Judge Mercy spoke up, her voice carrying the authority of her profession. "There's an animal in this barn that's been systematically tortured. The evidence of deliberate cruelty is unmistakable. And there's a dead man who tried to kill us for trying to help her," Clyde added. The bound gunman suddenly found his voice. "They're lying. Gideon Marsh owns that horse legal. These people stole it and killed Pike when he tried to get it back." Judge Morrison's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened. "Interesting, because Mr. Marsh filed a complaint in town claiming his horse was stolen, says he's got witnesses." The trap was becoming clear. Gideon had anticipated this moment, prepared his version of events before riding out to confront Clyde. But as the judge moved toward the barn to examine the mare, Clyde realized that some evidence couldn't be fabricated or explained away. The question was whether truth would be enough to overcome influence money and carefully constructed lies. Because in the next few minutes, everything would be decided by what the federal marshals saw in that barn and whether they were men who could be bought. Judge Morrison stepped into the barn and stopped dead. 20 years of frontier justice had shown him every form of cruelty humans could inflict on each other. But the systematic torture evident in the mare's condition struck him silent. The federal marshals flanked him, their professional composure cracking as they took in the evidence. "Sweet Jesus," whispered the lean marshal. "What kind of animal does this to a horse?" Mercy moved to the mare's side, her voice clinical but edged with controlled fury. The hooves were deliberately neglected until walking became agony. "These wounds around the head and neck are from restraints left on too long, and this scarring over the brand. Someone tried to alter it while the animal was conscious." The judge knelt beside the horse, his experienced eyes cataloging each injury. How long would this have taken? Months of systematic abuse. This wasn't done in anger or haste. Someone enjoyed making this animal suffer. The bound gunman shifted nervously against the barn wall. "You can't prove Mr. Marsh did any of that." Could have been anybody, but the second marshal, a grizzled veteran named Hayes, had been examining the altered brand more closely. "Actually, we can prove quite a bit. This is federal property." The words hit like a thunderbolt. Everyone turned to stare at Hayes as he pointed to the scarred flesh where someone had tried to obliterate the original marking. This mare was part of a shipment stolen from a federal remount station 6 months ago. "We've been tracking these animals across 3 territories. The original brand is still visible under the scar tissue. See that partial U.S. marking?" Clyde felt the ground shift beneath his feet. They weren't just dealing with local animal cruelty anymore. This was federal horse theft, which carried a mandatory death sentence in territorial court. Judge Morrison stood slowly, his face grave. "Mr. Burns, you've been harboring stolen federal property. That's a serious charge." "I didn't steal anything," Clyde protested. "I found her on my land, tortured half to death. And Gideon Marsh has filed sworn statements claiming you're the thief." The judge replied, "Says he can produce witnesses who saw you take possession of his property." The trap was perfect in its simplicity. Gideon had stolen federal horses, tortured at least one of them, then dumped the evidence on Clyde's property while positioning himself as the victim. Even if the truth eventually emerged, Clyde would hang for federal horse theft long before any investigation could clear his name. But Mercy stepped forward her professional credentials, lending weight to her words. Judge Morrison, I've examined this animal thoroughly. The pattern of injuries tells a story that contradicts Mr. Marsh's claims. These wounds were inflicted over months in a controlled environment. This horse was never free, roaming or wild. It was confined and systematically abused. Marshal Hayes nodded grimly, and the federal brand alteration was done with professional skill, not the kind of work you'd expect from a simple rancher. The bound gunman's nerve finally broke. I never signed up for this. Gideon said it was just business moving horses between territories. He never told us they were federal property. His confession exploded through the barn like a dynamite blast. Judge Morrison's expression hardened as the implications became clear. Are you willing to testify that Gideon Marsh was involved in the theft and abuse of federal livestock? If it keeps me from hanging, yes, sir, yes. I can tell you where he's got the other horses hidden. Who helped with the stealing everything? The sound of approaching riders interrupted the moment of triumph. Through the barn door, Clyde counted at least 15 men riding hard toward his ranch. Gideon had returned with overwhelming force, probably expecting to find 3 corpses in a conveniently timed barn fire that would destroy all evidence. Instead, he found federal marshals and a territorial judge taking testimony from his own man. Gideon reined in his horse just outside the barn, his face a mask of controlled fury as he took in the scene. But he was trapped by his own lies now. He'd positioned himself as the victim of horse theft, which meant he couldn't simply gun down everyone present without destroying his carefully constructed narrative. Judge Morrison, he said with forced calm, I see you've recovered my stolen property. I trust the thieves will face appropriate justice. But Judge Morrison's next words shattered Gideon's world. Mr. Marsh, you're under arrest for the theft of federal livestock conspiracy to defraud the United States government and animal cruelty. Marshal Hayes placed him in custody. The silence that followed was deafening. Gideon's hired men looked between their employer and the federal officers, calculating odds that suddenly looked impossible. Federal marshals carried authority that even Gideon's money and influence couldn't overcome. As the shackles closed around Gideon's wrists, Clyde felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of justice done right. The mayor lifted her head at the sound of voices, and for the first time since he'd found her, there was something other than pain in her eyes. 6 months later, Clyde watched that same horse run free in his pasture. Her injuries healed her spirit, slowly returning. Gideon Marsh had been hanged for federal horse theft, his criminal enterprise dismantled by federal investigation. The territory was a quieter, safer place without his influence. Sometimes Clyde reflected as he watched the mayor graze in the morning sunlight. Doing the right thing was its own reward. He'd found her covered by a bag, broken and hopeless. Now she ran free, and so did he. The loneliness didn't bother him anymore. Some solitudes were chosen, not imposed, and some choices, no matter how dangerous they seemed at the time, led exactly where they were supposed to. Everything to us,